Imagine being sold, not losing your freedom gradually, not being captured in battle and given a chance to negotiate, but sold, traded as property, transported across thousands of miles from your homeland to a foreign court where you are expected to serve, to obey, and to disappear into the background of someone else's story. Now imagine that from that position, from the very bottom of the medieval world, you rise to become the ruler of Egypt, that you are the one who defeats the King of France in battle, takes him prisoner, negotiates his ransom, and ends one of the most dangerous crusades ever launched against the Muslim world. And that you do all of this not just as a queen consort, not hiding behind a husband's title, but as a sovereign in your own right, with your name on the coins and your authority read from every pulpit in the land. That woman existed. Her name was Shajarat al-Durr, and today on Muslim Biographies we tell her story. Welcome to Muslim Biographies, where we bring the stories of Islam's greatest figures to life. Today's story is unlike anything we have covered before. It is the story of a woman who should be one of the most celebrated figures in medieval Islamic history, and who has been largely forgotten. Her name means Tree of Pearls, and this is her story. Almost nothing is known about her early life, and that itself tells you something. She was born somewhere around 1220 CE, most likely in the Kipchak Turkic steppe, lands of what is now southern Russia or Armenia. She was enslaved during the wave of Mongol expansion that was sweeping across Western Asia at that time, displacing entire peoples and feeding a vast trade in human beings across the medieval world. She was eventually acquired by the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, al-Salih Ayyub, a man who ruled one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world at one of its most dangerous moments. She entered his court as a concubine, a slave, a piece of property. She had nothing except her intelligence, her will, and whatever she could build from the ground up. But al-Salih Ayyub was so impressed by her intelligence and her capacity for statecraft, that he began to involve her in his political affairs. He took her with him on military campaigns, which was genuinely unusual. She bore him a son named Khalil, who died in infancy, but even without the leverage of a living heir, she had become indispensable to him. By 1240, al-Salih had freed her from slavery and married her. A slave woman had become the wife of the Sultan of Egypt, and she was not finished yet. Before we go any further, if you are finding this story powerful, please take 5 seconds right now and hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to a small channel like this one. Every subscriber tells the algorithm that these stories matter and helps us reach more people who deserve to hear them. Hit subscribe now and let us continue. In 1249, the 7th Crusade arrived in Egypt. King Louis IX of France, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, later declared a saint by the Catholic Church, landed his forces at Damietta in June of that year with the goal of using Egypt as a springboard to retake Jerusalem. His army was vast, his conviction was absolute, and at the very moment his forces began their advance toward Cairo, Sultan Salih Ayyub, the man who was supposed to stop him, was dying. And then in November 1249, he died. The Sultan of Egypt was dead. The Crusaders were advancing. His successor was thousands of miles away. The army was leaderless. The court was in panic. And in the middle of that panic, one person kept her head, Shajarat al-Durr. What she did next was one of the most audacious acts of political survival in the entire history of the medieval world. She concealed the death of the Sultan. She forged his signature on letters. She issued orders in his name. She kept the court and the army functioning as if al-Salih were still alive and in command. She worked alongside the Mamluk military commanders to coordinate the military response to the Crusader advance, and it worked. The Crusaders had no idea the Sultan was dead. The Egyptian army held together. The Mamluks drew Louis IX's forces into the town of al-Mansura in February 1250 and destroyed them in brutal street-to-street fighting. The Egyptian navy cut off the Crusaders' supply lines, and in April 1250 at the Battle of Farisca, the remaining Crusader army was annihilated. The King of France was captured. The 7th Crusade was over. The person who had held the Egyptian state together through its most dangerous months, who had kept the army functioning, managed the court, and maintain the political stability that made that victory possible, was a woman who had been a slave just 9 years earlier. When Turanshah arrived from Syria to claim his inheritance as Sultan, he immediately set about dismantling the power structures that had just saved Egypt, sidelining the Mamluks, and threatening Shajarat al-Durr personally, demanding she hand over the royal treasury and her own jewels. The Mamluks, who had no intention of being pushed aside, turned to Shajarat al-Durr. She gave them her protection. They gave her a throne. On the 2nd of May 1250, Turanshah was assassinated, and Shajarat al-Durr was proclaimed Sultana of Egypt. She was the first woman to rule Egypt as a sovereign in her own name since Cleopatra. Coins were minted bearing her titles. The Friday khutbah, the sermon read in the name of the ruler in every mosque, was read in her name. She signed royal decrees. She negotiated the final terms of the Seventh Crusade, arranging for Louis IX to be ransomed and released in exchange for the return of Damietta and a payment of 500,000 dinars. The final diplomatic negotiations were conducted between Shajarat al-Durr and Queen Margaret of Provence, the wife of Louis IX, who was managing affairs from the French side. The Seventh Crusade ended through the diplomacy of two queens, one Muslim, one Christian, both women in a world that had told them they had no place at the table. But the world was not ready for her. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad refused to recognize her authority. His message to the Egyptians was devastating in its contempt. "If you are left with no man fit to rule, then we will send you one of ours." The pressure was immense. Just 80 days into her reign, Shajarat al-Durr was forced to step down. The Mamluks proposed a solution. She would marry their commander Aybak, who would be Sultan in name while she continued to govern in practice. For 7 years it more or less worked, but it could not hold. When she discovered that Aybak was planning to take a second wife, a match that would give him independent political legitimacy and effectively end her influence, she made the most catastrophic decision of her life. She had him killed. The political backlash was swift and total. She was arrested, and in the most brutal and deliberately humiliating act of the entire story, she was handed over to the former first wife, whose husband she had taken. That woman's slaves beat Shajarat al-Durr to death with their wooden shoes. Her body was thrown from the walls of the citadel of Cairo. Later, her remains were gathered and placed in the mausoleum she had built for herself during her reign. It still stands in Cairo today. Her story is not a fairy tale. It was never meant to be. She lived in a world that had rules she could bend, but not break forever. She pushed further than any woman before her in Islamic Egypt had pushed. She did things that should have been impossible, and when she finally crossed a line that even her fiercest supporters could not defend, the world that had never truly accepted her power seized the opportunity to end it. But this cannot be taken away from her. The Mamluk dynasty she helped found went on to become the most powerful military force in the medieval Islamic world. It was the Mamluks who stopped the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, saving Islamic civilization from the same destruction that had already wiped out Baghdad. It was the Mamluks who finally expelled the Crusaders from the Holy Land. The dynasty Shajarat al-Durr helped birth lasted over 2.5 centuries. Every sultan who sat on that throne after her sat on the throne she had first occupied. She was described by contemporaries as endowed with great intelligence and capacity for the affairs of the kingdom. One scholar of Islamic history wrote that she had outstanding talents that were realized through crisis and frustrated by law, tradition, and brute force. That is as honest an assessment as a history can offer. Her name means tree of pearls. She was born with nothing and built everything. She saved Egypt when no one else could, and she paid for her ambition with everything she had. If this episode has given you something to think about, please share it with someone who needs to hear this story. And if you are not yet subscribed to Muslim Biographies, now is the time. Every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories of Muslim scholars, leaders, warriors, and visionaries whose contributions shaped the world, but whose names are too often forgotten. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us on this journey, because there are so many more extraordinary stories still to tell, and we are just getting started.